My mother-in-law held my daughter, looked me in the eye, and said, "It's a shame her skin is so dark, otherwise she'd be perfect." When I flashed my husband a look, she just smiled. I stayed silent. That was 3 months ago. This morning, she was crying in her jail cell, refusing to speak to her lawyer. I am a tanned, curly-haired Egyptian, while my husband Dan is a blonde, blue-eyed white man. I've been living in the US for the last 10 years, and no one has been racist towards me until we announced our engagement to our families. Because everyone was ecstatic, except my mother-in-law Martha. At first I figured it was just an off day for her, until I went to hug everyone. Because instead of hugging me back, she just stood there frozen and said, "Yeah, congrats, I guess." I know I should have been able to ignore her, but it hurt a lot, because I always had this image of my future, and it always involved a big happy family, so gaining her approval was everything to me. But just before I could say anything else, she ran inside the house crying. And when I tried to run after her, she said, "Stop following me. You're destroying the bloodline." I completely froze and just started zoning out. When I told my husband what happened, he immediately reassured me that it was us against the world, and I'd always be the most important woman in his life. We made love that same night, and 3 weeks later, we saw the 2 pink lines on a pregnancy stick. Throughout the pregnancy, my husband continued to prioritize me and our baby girl, meaning I didn't have to see anyone I didn't want to, including my mill, Martha. And just when I thought I couldn't possibly love anything more than Dan, Layla was born. She was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. She had my mom's luscious curls, her dad's icy blue eyes, and my tan skin. At that moment, I knew there was nothing in this world that could stop me from protecting her. My entire family loved her and spammed pictures of her on their private Instagram accounts, and Dan's family were equally as obsessed with her. So I knew our baby girl had the village to raise her, the one we always dreamed about. It was around this time that my mother-in-law got back in touch with Dan. She had seen all the baby photos and was begging to be a part of Layla's life. After me and Dan discussed it in depth, we agreed that most grandmothers are practically incapable of hating their grandchildren, despite how they feel about their DIL. So for this reason, we agreed that she could meet Layla, under monitored supervision from us both, obviously. Martha came over the next day. As soon as she looked at Layla, I saw her pupils enlarged to 3 times the size. I really thought she loved her. Me and Dan even let her pick Layla up, and our baby girl looked so happy I almost cried. "It's a shame her skin is so dark, otherwise she'd be perfect," Martha said, while holding Layla in her arms. Anger boiled my blood, and I flashed my husband a look. He shut it down, and there were no further comments made. She came over a few more times after that, and other than the cold glares she'd shoot my way, or the remarks to my husband about how it's not too late to move on, we were getting along pretty well. Sometimes we'd even let her babysit on Friday nights when me and Dan wanted to go on a walk by the beach, never longer than an hour. But as soon as our family was built, it was destroyed. It all started with a phone call. My brother had been in a car crash and was in the hospital. He tried to play it down as if it wasn't a big deal, but I knew better. I insisted on going to visit him, and because I was such a nervous wreck, Dan said he'd drive me. It was so last minute that no one else was available to babysit Layla, so we were forced to call Martha. "Yes, of course I'll babysit," she exclaimed enthusiastically. We left as soon as she arrived, and she promised to send pictures of how Layla was doing. My brother ended up being okay, left with just a mild concussion and body aches, but the hospital wait was around 5 hours, so I was watching those progress pictures like a hawk, and in them, I noticed something strange. All the photos were taken with what looked like very bright natural light, despite us being in the hospital until 11 p.m. And when I mentioned this to Dan, he thanked me for being such a great mother, but assured me I was reading too much into it, so I took his word for it. It wasn't until we got home that we realized how wrong we were. At first, we couldn't find Martha anywhere, but as Dan went to call her, I heard it. It sounded like Layla crying, except super muffled or something. I shot upstairs to the bathroom, but it was locked. My blood went cold and my mouth turned completely dry. Dan managed to break in, and what I saw utterly broke my heart. I saw my mother-in-law's face contorted as she tries to wake my baby girl. I saw Layla crying harder than I'd ever heard. Her skin was extremely inflamed and red, like it was lit on fire. I went into full panic mode and yelled at Dan to call an ambulance. I rode with her while Dan stayed behind to deal with Martha and the police, who had arrived right after the ambulance. As they closed the ambulance doors, I caught a glimpse of Dan standing in our doorway, looking utterly broken as he watched us leave. In the ambulance, the paramedics started an IV for Layla and monitored her vitals. They explained they needed to get the chemicals off her skin as soon as possible and treat the burns. I just sat there, holding her tiny hand and crying, completely in shock. The paramedic kept asking me questions about Layla's medical history, allergies, and what time we thought the cream had been applied. I answered mechanically, my eyes never leaving my daughter's face. At the hospital, they took Layla straight to the emergency treatment area. A team of doctors doctors and nurses surrounded her immediately. They carefully washed the cream off her skin using some kind of special solution, then applied burn treatments. Layla cried the entire time, and each sob felt like a knife in my heart. I stood in the corner of the room, hugging myself and fighting back nausea as I watched them work on my baby. The doctor in charge, Dr. Chen, came to talk to me after they had stabilized Layla. Her expression was serious, and I braced myself for the worst. The skin whitening cream that was applied to your daughter contains extremely dangerous chemicals, she explained. It's caused chemical burns over about 30% of her body. I couldn't speak, just nodded for her to continue. We've removed the cream and treated the burns, but she'll need careful monitoring. These chemicals can be absorbed through the skin and cause internal damage, especially to the kidneys and nervous system. Will she be okay? I finally managed to ask. Dr. Chen's face softened slightly. We caught it relatively early. If the cream had been left on much longer, or if it had been applied repeatedly, her chances would have been much worse. But I have to be honest with you, she's not out of danger yet. The next 24 to 48 hours will be critical. I must have swayed on my feet because a nurse suddenly appeared with a chair for me to sit in. Dr. Chen continued explaining Layla's treatment plan, but I was barely processing the words. All I could think about was that my baby girl might die because my mother-in-law couldn't stand her skin color. Dan arrived at the hospital about an hour later, looking like he'd aged 10 years. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hair disheveled, and his shirt was wrinkled and untucked. He hugged me tightly, both of us crying. The police arrested her, he said when we finally pulled apart. She's being charged with child endangerment and assault. Maybe more. They're still figuring it out. What did she say? Did she even try to explain? I asked. Dan shook his head. She kept saying she was helping Layla, that she was saving her from a life of discrimination. She doesn't think she did anything wrong. We sat together in Layla's hospital room, watching the monitors and listening to the beeping that told us our daughter was still fighting. The nurses came in regularly to check on her and apply more treatments to her burned skin. They were all so kind, but I could see the horror in their eyes when they looked at what had been done to our baby. Around 3 a.m., Dr. Chen came back to check on Layla. She seemed cautiously optimistic. Her vitals are stable, and the blood tests show the toxins aren't at life-threatening levels, she told us. We'll continue the treatments and monitoring, but I'm more hopeful now than I was earlier. It was the first bit of good news we'd had, and I broke down crying again, this time from relief. Dan held me tight, his own tears soaking into my hair. The next morning, my parents arrived at the hospital. They had immediately booked flights after I called them with the news. My mom took one look at Layla and burst into tears. My dad just stood there, his face a mask of rage and grief. Who would do this to a baby? My mom kept asking through her tears. Who could be so evil? I couldn't answer her. I still couldn't wrap my head around it myself. The police came to the hospital to take our statements. They explained that Martha was being held without bail pending a psychiatric evaluation. The detective in charge, a woman named Detective Quinn, was gentle but thorough in her questioning. We found evidence that suggests this wasn't a spontaneous act, Detective Quinn told us. There were receipts in her purse for multiple jars of this cream, ordered weeks ago, and we found a journal at her house with entries about fixing the baby. Dan looked physically ill at this news. She planned this? All this time? Detective Quinn nodded grimly. It appears so. We also found photos on her phone that matched the ones she sent you last night, but they were taken days ago, at her house. She was sending you old photos to make you think everything was fine while she carried out her plan. That explained the weird lighting in the photos. They hadn't been taken last night at all. Martha had been planning this for who knows how long, just waiting for an opportunity to get Layla alone. The next few days were a blur of hospital rooms, doctor consultations, and police interviews. Layla slowly began to improve. The redness in her skin started to fade, and her blood tests showed the toxins were leaving her system. She was still in pain, but the doctors assured us that babies her age likely wouldn't remember the trauma. Dan was completely devastated. He kept blaming himself for letting his mother back into our lives, for not seeing what she was capable of. I didn't blame him. How could anyone predict something like this? But he couldn't forgive himself. I should have known, he kept saying. After what she said when we got engaged, I should have known she was dangerous. My parents stayed with us, taking shifts at the hospital so Dan and I could occasionally go home to shower and change. My dad, who had always been the gentlest man I knew, was now talking about Egyptian justice for Martha. It was the first time I'd ever seen him truly angry. In our country, family is everything, he told Dan one night at the hospital. To harm a child is the greatest sin. This woman, she is not human. Dan just nodded, too exhausted and heartbroken to speak. On the 5th day, we got the news we'd been praying for. Layla was stable enough to come home. Her skin was still healing, and she would need special care for weeks, but the worst of the danger had passed. The doctors warned us she might have some scarring, particularly on her face and hands where the cream had been applied most heavily. heavily. We won't know the full extent of any permanent damage until she's a bit older, Dr. Chen explained. But children are remarkably resilient. With proper care, she has an excellent chance of making a full recovery. Taking Layla home was both wonderful and terrifying. The hospital had been stressful, but at least there were doctors and nurses right there if anything went wrong. Now it was just us, responsible for her continued recovery. My mom was a godsend during this time. She knew all sorts of traditional Egyptian remedies for skin healing and worked with Layla's doctors to create a care plan that combined modern medicine with gentle natural treatments. She made special olive oil mixtures that helped soothe Layla's still tender skin and sang old Egyptian lullabies that seemed to be the only thing that could get Layla to sleep. Dan's dad, Robert, and sister Jessica were horrified by what Martha had done. They came to visit as soon as Layla was home, bringing more gifts and offering any help we needed. Robert couldn't even look at pictures of Layla's injuries without tearing up. "I don't understand," he kept saying. "How could she do this? To her own granddaughter?" None of us had an answer. Martha's case was moving through the legal system. Her lawyer was trying for an insanity defense, claiming she had suffered some kind of psychotic break. The psychiatric evaluation had found she had extreme racial prejudices, but was otherwise mentally competent to stand trial. The prosecutor was pushing for the maximum charges possible. About 2 weeks after we brought Layla home, Detective Quinn came to our house with an update and more questions. "We found something concerning when we searched Martha's computer," she said, her expression grave. "There were emails between her and several other women in an online group called Pure Bloodlines. The content is disturbing, to say the least." She showed us printouts of some of the emails. They were full of racist rhetoric about preserving white genetics and reversing the damage of race mixing. There were even discussions about methods to correct biracial children, with Martha actively participating and sharing her plans for Layla. "These women were encouraging her?" I asked, feeling sick to my stomach. Detective Quinn nodded. "And not just encouraging, giving specific advice. The cream she used was recommended by another member who claimed to have used it on her biracial grandson." "Are you saying there are other children who've been hurt like Layla?" Dan asked, his voice shaking with anger. "We're investigating that possibility now. This group has members across several states. We're working with other jurisdictions to identify them all." This new information changed everything. What Martha had done wasn't just the act of one racist woman. It was part of an organized effort to harm biracial children. The thought that there were other babies out there suffering like Layla had made me physically ill. That night, after Detective Quinn left, Dan and I had a long talk about what we wanted to do next. We were both angry, like really angry, but also exhausted and focused on Layla's recovery. "I want to make sure this never happens to another child," I said as we sat on our bed, Layla finally asleep in her crib next to us. "I don't know how, but we have to do something." Dan nodded, taking my hand. "We will, I promise. But first, we need to get through the trial. Make sure my mother pays for what she did." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. Our lawyer advised us that it would be the first of many court appearances. Martha was facing multiple felony charges, and the discovery of the online group had added potential hate crime enhancements. The day before the hearing, I was changing Layla's bandages when I noticed something that made my heart skip. The skin on her cheek, which had been one of the worst burned areas, was healing better than expected. The angry redness had faded, and there was less scarring than the doctors had predicted. "Look," I said to Dan, carefully turning Layla's face so he could see. "It's healing." Dan leaned in, his eyes filling with tears. "She's going to be okay, isn't she? Our little fighter." I nodded, unable to speak through my own tears. In that moment, looking at our beautiful daughter who had survived something so horrible, I felt a surge of determination unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. Martha had tried to destroy our family. She had nearly killed our daughter because of the color of her skin. And now we knew she wasn't alone. There were others like her, targeting innocent children because of their mixed heritage. I gently stroked Layla's healing cheek, her blue eyes looking up at me trustingly. "Martha's about to find out exactly what happens to people who mess with our family," I said quietly. Dan looked at me, a new resolve in his eyes matching my own. "Yes, she is. And so is everyone else involved in that group." We didn't know exactly what form our fight would take yet. Legal action, advocacy, public awareness, probably all of the above. But we knew one thing for certain. What happened to Layla would not be in vain. We would make sure of it. As I looked down at my daughter, I remembered something my grandmother used to say. "Never mistake an Egyptian's kindness for weakness. We forgive, but we never forget." Martha and her racist friends were about to learn that lesson the hard way. The next morning, we headed to the courthouse for Martha's preliminary hearing. I was a nervous wreck, barely slept the night before. My mom stayed with Layla while we went, promising to call immediately if anything changed with her condition. I hated leaving my baby even for a few hours, but I needed to look Martha in the eyes when she faced a judge. The courthouse was this massive stone building downtown. As we walked up the steps, I noticed a small group of protesters with signs supporting Martha. My stomach dropped when I read messages like, "Protecting our heritage isn't a crime," and "Free Martha." Dan squeezed my hand and we pushed past them without making eye contact. Inside was even worse. Martha's online friends had shown up in force. About 15 women, all white, all with that same pinched hateful expression Martha always had when she looked at me. They whispered as we walked by, and one even had the nerve to say race traitor under her breath when Dan passed. I had to physically hold him back from confronting her. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected. Nothing like what you see on TV, just wooden benches, fluorescent lighting, and a judge's bench at the front. We sat in the front row behind the prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Valerie with short gray hair and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. When they brought Martha in, I wasn't prepared for how normal she looked. I guess I expected some kind of monster after what she'd done, but she was just Martha. Same blonde bob haircut, same pearl earrings she always wore. The only difference was the orange jumpsuit. She didn't look at us at first, but when she finally turned our way, there wasn't a hint of remorse in her eyes. Just that same righteous certainty that she'd done the right thing. The hearing itself was quick. The judge denied bail, citing the severity of the charges and Martha's demonstrated danger to the victim. Martha's lawyer tried arguing she wasn't a flight risk, but the judge wasn't having it. When he announced she'd remain in custody, Martha's supporters in the gallery started shouting about injustice. The judge threatened to clear the courtroom, and they quieted down. As they led Martha out, she finally spoke directly to us. "I was trying to help her," she said, her voice eerily calm. "You'll see I was right someday." Dan stood up like he was going to say something back, but I pulled him down. "She's not worth it," I whispered. "Let's just go home to Layla." Outside the courthouse, we ran into Detective Quinn. She pulled us aside to a quieter corner of the hallway, away from Martha's supporters who were still making a scene by the elevators. "We've identified 12 other members of that online group," she told us. "Search warrants are being executed as we speak in 5 different states." "Have you found any other children who were hurt?" I asked, dreading the answer. Quinn nodded grimly. 3 confirmed cases so far, 1 in Ohio, 1 in Florida, and 1 in Texas. All biracial children, all with chemical burns from various skin whitening products. I felt sick. 3 other babies had suffered like Layla. 3 other families were going through the same nightmare we were. "Are they okay? The children?" Dan asked. "They're all alive," Quinn said. "The case in Ohio is the worst. The child is about 2 years old and has been exposed to these chemicals repeatedly over several months. He's still in the hospital." I couldn't hold back my tears. The thought of a toddler enduring that kind of torture for months was too much to bear. Dan wrapped his arm around me, his own eyes wet. "We want to help," he said to Quinn. "Whatever we can do. Testify, speak to other families, anything." Quinn gave us her card. "I'll be in touch. The FBI is getting involved now since this crosses state lines. They'll probably want to talk to you too." The drive home was silent, both of us processing everything. When we got back, I practically ran to Layla's room. She was sleeping peacefully in my mom's arms, her little chest rising and falling steadily. The sight of her calmed my racing heart immediately. That night, after everyone else was asleep, I created a throwaway Reddit account and typed out everything that had happened. I wasn't even sure why I was doing it. Maybe I just needed to get it all out. Or maybe I thought someone else might be going through something similar and needed to know they weren't alone. I hit post around 3 a.m. and finally fell into an exhausted sleep. I woke up to my phone blowing up with notifications. My post had gone viral overnight. Thousands of upvotes, hundreds of comments, and multiple messages from news outlets wanting to verify my story. I showed Dan, and we decided to use this unexpected attention to our advantage. We contacted a lawyer friend of my brother's who specialized in civil rights cases. Her name was Casey, and she immediately offered to take our case pro bono. She came over that same day to discuss our options. "What happened to Layla isn't just a criminal matter," Casey explained as we sat at our kitchen table. "There's potential for a civil lawsuit against not only Martha, but potentially the entire online group and even the companies that manufacture and distribute these dangerous products. We don't care about money," I said quickly. "We just want to make sure this doesn't happen to any other children." Casey nodded. "A civil suit isn't just about compensation. It's about creating legal precedent and bringing public attention to the issue. The money, if we win, can go toward medical costs and a foundation to help other victims if you want." The idea of starting a foundation resonated with both of us immediately. We could turn this horrible experience into something positive, something that might protect other children from similar harm. With Casey's help, we decided to go public with our story. She arranged interviews with several major news outlets, making sure they understood our goal wasn't sensationalism, but raising awareness about the dangers these racist groups pose to biracial children. The response was overwhelming. Our first interview aired on a national morning show, and by that afternoon, we'd received hundreds of messages from other mixed-race families sharing their own experiences with racist relatives. Some were as horrific as ours, others were more subtle forms of discrimination, but all of them reinforced that this was a much bigger problem than most people realized. Martha's trial was scheduled for 6 months later. In the meantime, the FBI's investigation into the Pure Bloodlines group expanded gradually. They eventually identified over 50 members across the country, and arrests were made in multiple states. The evidence they uncovered was disturbing: detailed protocols for whitening biracial children, instructions for hiding evidence from parents, and even guidance on how to gradually increase chemical concentrations to avoid detection. Layla's recovery continued steadily. By the time she was 9 months old, most of her burns had healed completely. There was some slight slight scarring on her cheeks and hands, but the doctors were optimistic that even those would fade as she grew. Her pediatrician referred us to a dermatologist who specialized in chemical burn treatment, and he developed a long-term care plan to minimize any permanent damage. Throughout all of this, Dan's relationship with his father and sister grew stronger. Robert was absolutely devastated by what Martha had done and became one of our biggest supporters. He testified against her in pre-trial hearings, providing evidence of racist comments she'd made over the years that he'd previously dismissed as just how she was raised. Jessica helped us organize fundraisers for the foundation we were planning to start. The day Martha's trial finally began, the courthouse was packed. Our story had gained national attention, and the case was being viewed as a test of how seriously the justice system would take racially motivated crimes against children. We had decided that Dan would testify, but I would stay home with Layla. I couldn't bear the thought of being in the same room as Martha for days on end. Martha's defense strategy was predictable. Her lawyer tried to paint her as a mentally ill woman who genuinely believed she was helping her granddaughter. They brought in a psychiatrist who testified about delusional racial anxiety disorder, or some made-up condition. The prosecution demolished this argument with evidence of Martha's methodical planning and the fact that she had hidden her actions from us by sending old photos while she was actively harming Layla. The most powerful testimony came from the mother of the boy in Ohio. She described finding her 2-year-old son covered in chemical burns after her mother-in-law had been babysitting him regularly for months. The poor kid had suffered kidney damage from the chemicals being absorbed through his skin over time. Her testimony left everyone in the courtroom in tears, except Martha and her supporters. After 2 weeks of trial, the jury took less than 4 hours to reach a verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Martha to 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 10 years. As they led her away, she still showed no remorse, just looked at Dan and said, "I did what any good grandmother would do." The civil case took longer, but ended with an even bigger impact. Casey was brilliant, building a case not just against Martha, but against the manufacturers of the skin whitening products that contained dangerous chemicals and were being illegally imported into the U.S. The companies settled for millions rather than face a public trial, and we used every penny to establish the Layla Foundation for the protection of biracial children. By Layla's first birthday, our foundation had already helped 5 families with medical expenses for children injured by similar attacks. We'd also started an education campaign targeting pediatricians, teachers, and social workers to help them identify signs of this specific type of abuse. The FBI credited our awareness efforts with helping identify several more cases that might otherwise have gone undetected. Layla herself was thriving despite everything she'd been through. Her curls grew back even more beautiful than before, and her blue eyes sparkled with mischief as she learned to walk, constantly getting into everything. The scars on her cheeks had faded to faint lines that were barely noticeable unless you knew to look for them. Her dermatologist said they would likely continue to fade as she grew. My parents eventually returned to Egypt but visited often. My mom insisted on FaceTiming daily to sing to Layla in Arabic, determined that her granddaughter would grow up knowing both sides of her heritage. Dan started learning Arabic too, practicing with Layla as they played together on the living room floor. About a year after the trial, we received a letter from Robert. He had filed for divorce from Martha and was legally changing his last name back to his mother's maiden name. He didn't want to share a name with someone who had done such a terrible thing. Jessica followed suit, and Dan decided to do the same. We all became Clarks instead of Millers, a small but meaningful way of distancing ourselves from Martha's legacy of hate. We moved to a new house in a different neighborhood, partly for a fresh start, and partly because our old place held too many painful memories. Our new home was in a much more diverse area, with neighbors from all different backgrounds. Layla had playdates with kids of every color, exactly the kind of childhood we had always wanted for her. On Layla's second birthday, we had a big party in our backyard. Friends, family, and even some of the other families we'd met through the foundation came to celebrate. As I watched Layla toddle around in her birthday crown, laughing and playing with the other children, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since before the attack. Dan came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. "She's perfect," he whispered, watching our daughter. "Yes, she is," I agreed, exactly as she was meant to be. That night, after all the guests had gone home and Layla was asleep surrounded by her new toys, Dan and I sat on the porch swing, looking at the stars. We didn't talk about Martha or the trial or any of the darkness we'd been through. Instead, we talked about Layla's future, preschool options, whether she might want to play soccer or take dance classes, if she'd inherit my talent for drawing or Dan's for music. In the end, Martha failed. She tried to destroy our family, to erase Layla's Egyptian heritage, but she only made us stronger. Our daughter would grow up proud of both sides of her background, surrounded by people who loved her exactly as she was, and thanks to the foundation bearing her name, other biracial children would be protected from people like Martha. As for those Egyptian consequences I mentioned, well, Martha would spend the next decade in prison, her name forever associated with hatred and abuse. Her online group was dismantled, its members facing criminal charges across the country, and our family, the mixed, beautiful, loving family she had tried to tear apart, was thriving. Sometimes the best revenge isn't what you do to your enemies, it's living well despite them.